Hi, everybody. Thank you for listening to my talk this morning. And, I mentioned in the talk this new paper from Harvard Business School, and I want to welcome Frank Nagle, Professor Nagle, one of the authors of this paper, to our conversation space here today. Professor Nagle is an assistant professor in the strategy unit at Harvard Business School and studies how competitors can collaborate on the creation of core technologies while still competing on the products and services built on top of them. And if you are here today, that sounds like a very familiar description of the world we live in open source, right? And so it is no surprise, given that research interest, that you are writing and thinking about open source. So welcome to Upstream. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So you're an author, along with two other scholars, on a recent analysis of open source, suggesting that the value of open source is $8.8 trillion. And I just want to sit with that number a little bit, because I've talked to a lot of people about your paper, and I have to keep correcting people because they hear it, but their brain registers billion. And so they say back like, oh yeah, 8 billion, that sounds like a lot. And like, no, 8 trillion, which sounds like even more. And I sort of want to start simply by saying, did the size of this number surprise you? Or did you have some sense of the order of magnitude when you started the work?
Yeah, it did. It definitely did, because, we were expecting something in the billions and ended up with something in the trillions, much like the people you talk to. And so I think, our first reaction was, this can't be right. We must have done something wrong. Let's go and check. And, we looked into, like any research, we were making some assumptions and we played with those. But what we came to understand and, highlight in part of the paper is that this represents, if we think about this as the total global spend on software, it's only really 3-4 times more than that, right? And then when you pair that with the fact that some code bases are of paid software are 90+% made up of open source, then you can start to think that this is actually a plausible number, right? And when we think about everyone who's using open source out there and and how they're using it and the value that they're getting from it, it starts to sound like more of a plausible number than perhaps the initial kind of gut check of trillions of dollars worth of value.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is I think everybody involved knows, like, well, there's a lot of value here. And then, and so it's not, nobody is, it's one of those things that surprises you, but doesn't surprise you. For those in the audience who haven't read the paper, why don't we talk a little bit more about it? Could you summarize the methods you use to get to this number and tell us a little bit more about, like, what is it you're valuing here?
Sure. Yeah. So, so from a starting point, just the way that economics and management and think about value, often it's, we take the price of something and multiply it by the quantity, right? And that's kind of at least the total, value that is being created or is being kind of, trading hands in terms of that product or whatever it is. Now, of course, the problem with open source is that price generally equals zero, and so anything times zero is zero. So that's why it's a hard problem. And then even more kind of complicated is quantity, right? And so we know open source is out there, but by design, people can copy it and use it, and there's no real central place of where we know how much open source is actually being used. And so that was sort of task one, was really getting some measure of quantity of open source. And that came together through our partnership with the Linux Foundation and running the census of open source software usage, where we partnered with a number of companies to be able to understand what open source is being baked into the software that thousands of companies or tens of thousands of companies are using across the world. And so that was kind of the first part, where we came to get some measure of the open source that's being used internally at companies. And then we paired that with data from web scans that essentially look at all the web technology that's internet facing, right? So the census kind of captures stuff behind the firewall, and then the internet scans capture open source being used outside the firewall attached to the internet. And certainly this isn't all open source. It's sort of in some ways an underestimation of the open source that's out there. But in aggregate, we have a good kind of survey of the open source that exists out there. So that's how we got the kind of quantity side of things. And then on the price side, there's a couple of different ways you can think about price. We focused in on a method that others have used in measuring the value of software, and that's thinking about the amount of human power or human hours that have to go into the creation of any given piece of software. And so we use this model. It was actually developed in a while ago, 20, 30 years ago, for the Defense Department for kind of estimating the cost of software projects for them. And it's called Kokomo 2. And basically what it does is you kind of feed in a project or an amount of source code or something like this, and it sort of spits out, here's how much we would estimate based on a few parameters, how long it would take to create this software. Then we can use a bunch of different measures on developer salaries and things like that, and finally get an estimated price for each kind of piece of open source software that we see out there. And so then it's just a matter of multiplying those two together, and that gets you to $8.8 trillion.
Right. And then that gets you to a sort of shockingly large. Yeah, I mean, this kind of stuff, you mentioned Kokomo. I mean, people have been, you're part of a sort of long tradition at this point of trying to figure out this number, right? I mean, I remember seeing Kokomo applied to Debian in the early 2000s, and there's been some fun experiments on valuing Wikipedia, which is a similar kind of problem of, well, people don't pay for it, but what is it? It's really a fascinating problem. I mean, you mentioned in the paper, you talk about how you appreciated the feedback from the Values and Valuation Conference, and this question of why do we value this? How do we value this? I think sometimes, it can be, it's not just technically challenging, it's also somewhat fraught, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's, that conference was interesting. There were lots of different people from very different backgrounds. It wasn't all about tech, or certainly wasn't all about open source. But and I think that's one of the challenges that lots of folks who work in open source face day to day, right? Is convincing their managers that, we use this stuff. It's an important part of the tools that we're building or the work that we do. And so we should be, contributing back, right, in some way. Whether that's financially or fixing bugs or adding new features or documentation, all the various things we care about in open source. And so the hope was to kind of, by putting a price tag on this at kind of the global scale, to be able to shift the conversation at the managerial level, the policy level, to say, oh, this stuff is actually adding massive amounts of value to society when we think about policymakers, but the company itself when we think about an individual company. So that the technologists who are working on this as part of their day job, or perhaps not as part of their day job, at nights and weekends, can actually have some leverage to go to their managers and say, we're working on this stuff. It's super important to what we're doing, what we're selling. So you should support these efforts of our developers in a way that's more meaningful than just saying it's okay. Right. So we ran a study 4 years ago, I think at this point, that was sort of a survey of maintainers in the open source world, and found that many of them, actually, their companies had policies that prevented them from contributing to open source in any meaningful way. And certainly, I think things have shifted a lot in the last 4 years. But hopefully, this adds again to the ammunition that people can bring to have these discussions at the boardroom or lower down in the organization about the importance of using and contributing back and supporting open source as well.
Yeah, sure. And it's certainly also caught the attention of policymakers as well, right? I mean, I think this is, as you say, this is actually a question I was going to ask later, but it I think speaks to what you're talking about right here. this is, I mean, you've been publishing in this space for a long time, and I do want to get to some of this history in a bit, but this paper, even though it's only been out a few months, has done tremendous download numbers by academic standards, right? Several thousand people have grabbed it from SSRN, I assume also from other sources. I know it's been circulating. I've certainly talked about it a bunch in Tidelift's blog and on social media. It seems to have sort of caught the zeitgeist at all a little bit. Was that a pleasant surprise for you?
Certainly a pleasant surprise. It was definitely a surprise, though, because I think, having worked on this stuff for these types of things for a long time, in the academic world, it's a very small niche of people that are interested in open source, which is probably true of the broader tech world as well, that there's a small niche interested in open source, but growing in both these domains. And so I think, I'm happy with, a couple hundred downloads, right? So to see a couple thousand in the first few weeks was pretty incredible. And I think that, again, just shows the desire to have this type of information out there. And everybody for decades has known that open source is super valuable, but being able to actually quantify it in some meaningful way, I think has just allowed people to take the conversation further, right? And I do think the timing was sort of fortuitous because on the policy side, after many years of not doing much of anything related to open source, I think both, in the EU and in the US over just the past few years, and in the US, especially the last year or so, there's been a whole lot more effort and focus on open source, right? And so this is coming out of the Log4j incident, and certainly very recently the XZ incident. I think people are starting to better understand, even if they know nothing about open source, they're starting to understand that it's really important, right? And that, and so again, I think when this, hit the scene a couple months ago, it was at a good time that people were trying to think about how do we quantify this value? How do we think about what we should be investing in it both from a government level and from a company level? And I think that, kind of a perfect storm of interest around the topic right around when we released it.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think knowing from some other domains, the impact of that nice, literally what people call the headline number, in conversations with my own family, where sometimes I get the sense where I say like, oh no, the entire world depends on our work. And you get the little pat on the head, and then you say, no, HBS says the entire world depends on our work. And people go, oh, all right. Okay.
That is a lucky perk of working in a place like HBS is people tend to pay attention to what you say.
Indeed.
For better or worse.
Sure. As we've also seen in recent headlines. So you've been working in this space for a while, right? Your first publication, at least that I could find in sort of this general topic, was in 2013 about the value of Apache specifically. What attracted you to this area? How'd you get involved?
Sure. Yeah. So I worked, like many academics, especially those in business schools. I worked in industry for 5 or 10 years before coming back to academia. I worked in the cybersecurity sector, and so I was around tech and saw tech, and I saw my own company as well as others starting to try and understand how open source played a role in their business. And this was, in the early 2000s, right? And so they were thinking about, we use this stuff, it's free, it's valuable, but should we let our own employees give back to it? And so, for example, the last company I worked at, we developed some internal tools, and the decision was made to kind of open source them and allow them to, be out there in the public for free. And so for me as kind of a technologist by training, but somebody that was always interested in the business side of tech, I was very curious as to, why the leadership made that decision. And they were basically like, it seemed like the right thing to do. This wasn't like the most valuable thing to creating to what we do for our customers, but it's something we thought everybody would find very useful. And so we gave the developers of it the green light to, go ahead and open it. And so, from then I was like, okay, so they're just sort of, making this stuff up as they go along, right? And so as I, went back into the academic world, the open source as well as cybersecurity were always kind of in the back of my mind and moved to the front of my mind to kind of think about how do businesses actually make decisions about when they should do this or how they should do this or why they should do this, because I think a whole lot of the traditional kind of strategy and management literature says that, you know, you should own everything and own the resources internally, and it's only the things that you have that your competitor doesn't have that really drive value and allow you to compete in the marketplace. And open source is really, you know, flip that on its head, right? Because by the traditional methods, no company should be thinking about allowing their people to work on open source. But what we're seeing more and more is that there's many cases where companies can allow their people to work on stuff and open it, even if that means their competitors can use it for free. And so this, you know, I just came off of finished up teaching for the semester, and what I talk about with my students a whole lot is this notion of collaborating on the core and competing on the edges. And that's because when we think about the technology stack and what companies are actually creating, often it's the core of the underlying technology is not really what's driving the value of why somebody chooses to buy your product versus somebody else's product. And so if we can kind of save a whole bunch of costs by working with open source and using open source and helping maintain it, and then we can compete on what's built on top of that and all the bells and whistles and all the nice things that, you know, the customers really are willing to pay for, then that's better for everyone. Right? And that's, I think, the focus of, you know, what I learned way back in the day, 15, 20 years ago from working in industry has led me down this path to really think about, you know, what is the value of open source? When do firms use it? When should they contribute back to it? And, you know, how does that impact things like competition and productivity and all these things that economists and management folks care about, has been the kind of crux of all the research I've done so far.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, certainly my experience has been that a lot of business leadership are so used to the sort of, well, the first thing we do is a cost benefit analysis. What's our ROI? And if you can't slap a number on the thing, that confounds a lot of those traditional tools. And then, of course, it all went ahead and happened anyway.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, are there any big changes you observed in that time that you know, either both in your own, you know, how you've grown in your own work or in the responses you've seen to that work?
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, when I was a doctoral student and kind of starting on this stuff and presenting it around at conferences and talking to people about it, I'd have to spend, you know, the first 10 slides explaining what open source is and why it's important and, you know, how it works and all these types of things. And now, you know, today, that's basically condensed to the one XKCD graphic of the random person in Nebraska maintaining the whole, you know, modern infrastructure, right? And so people have heard of open source, they're familiar with it, they may not be familiar with the intricacies of it or realize that it's running on their phones, their fridges, their cars, everything they do on a daily basis, but they have a better understanding, a better baseline of what it is, right? And so that certainly made the conversation a little bit easier, you know, both on the academic side, but also on the practitioner side, as to, you know, why this stuff is important. Okay, we get it. Like, it's baked into everything and we have to support it and these types of things. And I do think, too, what's been fascinating to see is that, you know, there were very few people in the academic world researching open source a decade ago. And now I meet new people all the time, right? And that are working on this type of stuff. And that's great. I think it's great to see more and more folks thinking about this from both the technical side and also the economic and value side, and then also kind of the managerial side and how we, you know, give guidance to managers about how to think about it, right? And so I think it's great that there's a lot more folks doing this. That does lead to, I will say, me reading other people's papers and saying, oh, I wish I had thought of that. That's a great idea. But I'm glad to see that it's, you know, out there in the public, even if it, you know, wasn't me and my team that were, that did the research.
Yeah, well, I noticed that even just in the past couple days before we did the recording, you published yet another paper on this stuff. So I'm going to have to read that one after we, while I was doing prep for the call, I saw that. So congratulations on continuing your productivity there and helping this renaissance. Because I think I first interacted with business school professors around this in 2002. And it was very much that same vibe of like, you do what on the internet? And so it is great to see how far that's come. You know, I mean, I think part of, I think your paper is actually going to play a pretty key role in that, again, just because that headline number, um, it's similar to the value of like the national highway system, the electrical grid. I mean, these are the other kinds of things that when we're talking about trillion-dollar infrastructure, and those things we almost take for granted, that of course there's a sophisticated government role, which, as you already mentioned, cybersecurity, and the rest of a lot of the panels today will be touching on the cybersecurity problem, and so we won't go too deep into that. But do you think there are implications once we start grouping this with more traditional kinds of infrastructure, either for business or for government?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that, there's a couple of major differences between open source and traditional infrastructure that are will at least kind of shape the nuances of how, if and when, and how much the government and other kind of governmental organizations get involved. Number one is that it's digital, not physical, right? And so there's all sorts of research and different on the differences between kind of physical investments and digital investments. Obviously, in the physical world, every foot of pavement that you put in the highway, you got to pay for, that much more tar or concrete or whatever it is, right? Whereas in the digital world, you do it once and then everybody can copy it and use it for free, right? And so I think there's a scale differential there that's going to kind of go back to the kind of cost benefit analyses, right? That's going to be a little bit different than how we think about traditional physical infrastructure. The other piece of it too, I think, will be that there's this notion in kind of public goods of the ability to prevent people from using it, right? So take for example a toll road, right? I can say, the government can build this road and then say, everybody needs to help support this, and so we're going to charge a toll for it. And even more so if you think about, we're going to let you into the country or not, and then if you get into the country, then you can use our roads for free, but people in other countries have to go through a process to get in the first place, right? And so very different from that, it's once digital software is out there, it's hard to slap a toll on it or to prevent people from using it if it's been put out in the open domain. And we're seeing, I think there's a whole bunch of kind of business models that are evolving now that revolve around trying to kind of claw back stuff that's been put in the open domain. And that's, even then everybody just kind of forks from an earlier version and they're, it's still out there and free, right? And I think there's a lot of tension around that now, and the team's actually starting to do some research around kind of licenses and license shifting and some of the games that are being played around, within the open source world. But I do think that there is a role for government, but again, it's the nature of open source is so different that it's created in this distributed way rather than something like a road. It's not like everybody's going out to their street and putting down their own bit of pavement, right? So that in the end we all have a road we can drive on, but we did it kind of bit by bit. But that's quite different than open source. So how we think about government, involving and inducing and encouraging open source to be used and to be built and to be maintained, I think will require different strategy than the ways that we think about traditional physical infrastructure that the government is very used to helping out with. And so this is going to be quite different on many dimensions.
Yeah, and certainly on the flip side, there will be lots of challenges in accepting that kind of aid should it come. I mean, the good and the bad part of this kind of the intellectual project really that you're embarking on is that by shoving open source into some boxes that policymakers and business leaders are familiar with, it does make it more tractable for them, but it risks sort of rubbing off some of the edges that make this so interesting. Anything, we're almost out of time here now. Anything in particular sort of that you're really thinking about next? You just mentioned this question of changing licenses and how that impacts business models. Any other interesting stuff we might look forward to from you or your co-researchers?
Sure, yeah. So there's a couple of things coming down the pipeline. One, you mentioned the paper that came out fairly recently. We're digging more into entrepreneurs and startups and trying to understand the importance that open source can play with startups across the world, and whether or not it can be, kind of a stepping stone for developing countries, for example, to kind of jump to the next level of technology much faster than they would have been able to otherwise. And we're finding that in some cases that does happen, but in other cases where there's not sort of a complementary investments in sort of technical skills, that it can actually still be hard for people to take advantage of open source, right? So I think that's a big piece of what the team is looking at. And then the other big piece is, of course, AI, right? We can't talk about tech without talking about AI and Gen AI in particular, in this day and age. And so the team's looking at a couple different dimensions on kind of, when should AI be more open? When should it be more closed? What parts of the the model, the weights, the data, the infrastructure should be more open or less open? And how do we think about, again, back to companies and thinking about how they derive competitive advantage and where should they be thinking about that tension? And then even, more directly or more kind of base level, thinking about how tools like driven by Gen AI are changing the way that open source is being developed. So I was just had a meeting earlier today with my team talking about some work we're doing on Copilot on GitHub and how that can kind of shift people's the way that they allocate their time on open source in different ways, right? So they may spend more time on coding and less time on kind of doing open things and managing issues or communicating with other people or these different things. And so we've seen that access to these types of AI-driven tools may actually shift the behaviors of open source maintainers and contributors in ways that are not always exactly what we would expect, but are important to thinking about the future of open source and the sustainability of open source and how we can support the ecosystem as it gets bigger and bigger and more intricate and more integrated into kind of everyday life. So that's all on the horizon in the near to medium future.
Well, that's super interesting. So I hope then we can have you back next year to talk about some more of that, because
that would be great.
Definitely all going to be very top of mind for everybody, both the developers and executives. So thank you so much again for your time, Professor Nagle. We really appreciate it, and hope we wish you the best of luck in the rest of your research, because it's all very interesting and very potentially impactful stuff. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It was great to be with you.